August 1st, 1944, 4:55 p.m., Warsaw, Poland. The summer sun hangs low over the Vistula River, casting long golden shadows across a city that has lived in the shadow of the swastika for 5 agonizing years. To the casual observer, the streets seem tense but relatively normal. German patrols march in formation. Trams rattle down the tracks. Civilians hurry home before curfew, but look closer. In doorways, young men and women are adjusting armbands, white and red, the colors of a nation that supposedly no longer exists. Underneath trench coats, hands grip the cold steel of hidden pistols, old hunting rifles, and homemade submachine guns. In basements, boys are preparing bottles filled with gasoline and thickened with sugar. Molotov cocktails, the poor man's anti-tank weapon. The city is holding its breath. The air is electric, with a secret shared by 50,000 souls. To the east, just across the river, the thunder of artillery rolls like an approaching storm. The Soviet Red Army, the enemy of their enemy, is at the gates. The German Wehrmacht, beaten and bloody, is retreating in disarray. The Nazi Empire is crumbling. For the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, the moment of destiny has arrived. The order has been given. Godzina W hour, 5 p.m. The plan is desperate but simple. Rise up, seize the city. Throw off the German yoke before the Soviets arrive, and greet the Red Army not as a conquered people, but as the free hosts of their own capital. It is a gamble for sovereignty, for dignity, and for the very soul of Poland. At 5 p.m. exactly, a single shot rings out near Napoleon Square. Then another, then 1,000. Windows fly open. Grenades rain down on German patrols. The Polish flag, banned for 1,700 days, unfurls from rooftops. For a brief, shining moment, there is euphoria. There is hope. But they do not know what is coming. They do not know that the Soviet tanks across the river will stop their engines and watch in silence. They do not know that Adolf Hitler, in a fit of apoplectic rage, will issue an order that will turn their city into a slaughterhouse. Warsaw, Hitler screams to his generals, must be pacified, that is, razed to the ground. What follows is not a battle. It is a descent into the abyss. 63 days of heroism, betrayal, and annihilation. 63 days where a city fought the world and the world looked away. This is the story of the Warsaw Uprising. To understand the explosion of August 1st, you must understand the pressure cooker that was Warsaw in 1944. Since September 1939, Poland had been the laboratory for Nazi racial policy. It was a place where the concept of Untermensch, subhuman, was applied with terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. The occupation was brutal beyond measure. Street roundups, known as lapankas, were daily occurrences. Civilians were snatched off the street and sent to forced labor camps or simply shot against the nearest brick wall. The Jewish ghetto had been liquidated a year prior, burned to ash after its own heroic doomed uprising in 1943. But beneath the surface of terror, a second state existed, the Polish underground state. It was the largest and most sophisticated resistance movement in occupied Europe. It had its own courts, its own schools, its own press, and its own army. The Armia Krajowa, or AK. The AK was not a ragtag band of partisans. It was a disciplined military organization, loyal to the Polish government in exile in London. Its soldiers were students, professors, factory workers, and Boy Scouts. They trained in secret, Stripping and reassembling weapons in basements by candlelight, they studied urban warfare tactics in clandestine classrooms. By the summer of 1944, the geopolitical tectonic plates were shifting. The German war machine was breaking. In the West, the Allies had landed in Normandy. In the East, the Soviet juggernaut, Operation Bagration, had smashed the German Army Group center, obliterating 28 divisions. The Soviets were pushing toward the Vistula River, the waterway that bisects Warsaw. To the Poles, the retreating Germans looked beaten. Ragged, dirty Wehrmacht soldiers were seen fleeing through the city, commandeering carts, looking over their shoulders. The AK leadership, led by General Tadeusz Komorowski, faced an agonizing dilemma. If they did nothing, the Soviets would liberate Warsaw. But Stalin had already shown his hand. In eastern Poland, AK units that had helped the Soviets were arrested, disarmed, and executed. Stalin did not want a free, independent Poland. He wanted a puppet state. If the AK rose up and liberated Warsaw before the Soviets entered, they could establish a Polish civilian government. They could present Stalin with a fait accompli. They could say, "Welcome to Poland. We are the lawful authority here." It was a political gamble played with human lives. They needed to hold the city for a few days, perhaps a week, until the Russians crossed the river. They had courage. They had the element of surprise. What they didn't have was weapons. The inventory of the Warsaw district of the Home Army on July 31st was heartbreaking. For 50,000 mobilized soldiers, they had rifles for only 2,000. They had machine guns for barely a few hundred. They had virtually no heavy weapons, no anti-tank guns, no artillery, no tanks. The vast majority of insurgents went into battle armed with nothing but a pistol with 2 magazines, or a homemade grenade, or simply a fervent wish to capture a weapon from a dead German. They were banking everything on a short fight. They had food and ammunition for 3 to 7 days. They were about to fight for 2 months. The afternoon of August 1st was rainy and overcast. The tension in the streets was palpable. Young men in long coats, sweating in the summer humidity, moved towards their assembly points. Couriers, often young girls on bicycles, raced through the city delivering the mobilization orders. At 5 p.m., Godzina W, the city erupted. From thousands of windows, balconies, and cellar hatches, fire poured down on the German occupiers. In the city center, AK units stormed the post office, the power station, and the Prudential Building, the highest skyscraper in Warsaw. The Germans were caught completely off guard. For 5 years, they had been the masters. Now, suddenly, they were the hunted, patrols were ambushed and annihilated. Police stations were besieged. One of the most iconic moments occurred on the first day. A unit of the AK attacked a German convoy. In the chaos, they captured a German Panther tank. They didn't know how to drive it properly, but they painted a white eagle on its turret and turned its gun against the occupiers. The psychological impact was immense. By the evening of August 4th, the insurgents controlled most of the city center, Śródmieście, the old town, Stare Miasto, and large swaths of the Mokotów and Żoliborz districts. The atmosphere was intoxicating. German street signs were torn down. Polish flags waved in the breeze. For the first time in 1,700 days, Radio Błyskawica, Radio Lightning, broadcast the Polish national anthem across the airwaves. People cried in the streets. They embraced strangers. They felt free. But the victory was incomplete. The insurgents had failed to capture the strategic bridges over the Vistula. They had failed to secure the airport. And critically, they had failed to link up their various districts. The liberated areas were islands in a German sea, separated by heavily fortified enemy corridors, and the German reaction was coming. It would not be a police action. It would be a war of extermination. When news of the uprising reached Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Führer did not panic. He saw an opportunity. He turned to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. "This is a blessing," Hitler reportedly said. "We will wipe them out. Warsaw will be liquidated. It will serve as a terrifying example to the whole of Europe." The task of suppressing the uprising was not given to regular Wehrmacht generals. It was given to the SS, specifically to Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, an expert in anti-partisan warfare. But before von dem Bach arrived, the initial response fell to two of the most notorious units in the history of warfare: the Dirlewanger Brigade and the Rona Brigade, Kaminsky Brigade. The Dirlewanger Brigade was composed of convicted criminals, poachers, murderers, and rapists, released from prison in exchange for military service. They were led by Oskar Dirlewanger, a psychopath and a convicted child molester. The Rona Brigade was made up of Russian collaborators, traitors to the Soviet Union, led by Bronislaw Kaminsky. They were essentially a marauding band of looters and killers in uniform. These were the men unleashed upon the district of Wola, August 5, 1944. The Wola district. The order from Himmler was explicit. Every inhabitant is to be killed. No prisoners are to be taken. Warsaw is to be razed to the ground. What happened in Wola over the next few days is difficult to describe without losing faith in humanity. It was not combat. It was an industrial-scale slaughter of civilians. The SS units moved house by house, street by street. They dragged residents out of their apartments, men, women, children, the elderly, the sick from hospitals. They didn't just shoot them. They herded them into courtyards, into cellars, into factories. They threw grenades into basements, packed with families. They set fire to buildings with people still inside. In the Wola hospital, they shot the doctors and nurses, then moved bed to bed, executing the patients. In the St. Adalbert's Church, thousands were gathered. They were led out in groups and machine-gunned against the cemetery wall. The bodies piled up so high that the executioners had to climb atop the corpses of the previous victims to shoot the next group. Within 5 days, an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 civilians were murdered in Wola alone. It remains one of the largest single battlefield massacres of World War II, yet it is barely known outside of Poland. The aim was terror. The Germans believed that such brutality would break the Polish will to fight. They were wrong. When news of the Wola massacre filtered to the other districts, it did not cause surrender. It caused a hardening of hearts. The Poles realized there was no way out. Surrender meant death. Fighting meant death. But perhaps death with honor. As one insurgent wrote in his diary, "We are not fighting for victory anymore. We are fighting for the choice of how we die." While Wola burned, all eyes in Warsaw turned to the east, to the Vistula. The Soviet Red Army, the mighty steamroller that had crushed the Wehrmacht across 1,000 miles of steppe, had arrived. Their tanks were in the suburb of Praga, on the east bank of the river. Their fighters controlled the skies. The Poles could see the flashes of Soviet artillery at night. They could hear the rumble of the T-34 tanks. They waited for the offensive that would cross the river and crush the Germans caught between the hammer of the Red Army and the anvil of the Uprising. But the offensive never came. On the orders of Joseph Stalin, the Red Army stopped. They turned off their engines. They grounded their air force. Stalin dismissed the uprising as a criminal adventure by power-hungry bunches. He knew that if the Germans killed the AK, his problem was solved. The Germans would do the dirty work of destroying the Polish anti-communist leadership, leaving a vacuum the Soviets could fill. For the soldiers of the AK, it was a betrayal of biblical proportions. They watched as German Stuka dive bombers, flying leisurely patterns because there were no Soviet fighters to stop them, pulverized block after block of the city. The Western Allies, the Americans and British, were desperate to help. They wanted to fly supply missions, but the distance from Italy to Warsaw was extreme. To carry a meaningful payload, the planes needed to land in Soviet-held territory to refuel before returning. Stalin refused. He denied American and British planes permission to land on Soviet airfields. It was a death sentence for the city. The Allied pilots flew anyway. Polish, British, South African, and American crews flew 1,000-mile round trips from Brindisi, Italy. They flew low over the burning city, dropping canisters of weapons and food into the shrinking pockets of resistance. Many were shot down, but the drops were often inaccurate, the canisters drifting into German lines. It was a drop in the ocean. By mid-August, the Germans had contained the uprising. Now, they began to squeeze. Their primary target was Stare Miasto, the Old Town. The Old Town was a warren of narrow medieval streets, stone churches, and dense tenements. It was defended by the elite units of the AK. The Germans surrounded it. They brought in heavy artillery. They brought in the Nebelwerfer, multi-barreled rocket launchers that the Poles called screaming cows or wardrobes because of the terrifying noise they made. They brought in the Goliath tracked mines, miniature remote-controlled tanks packed with explosives. They drove them into barricades and detonated them. For 2 weeks, the Old Town was a hell on earth. The shelling was continuous. There was no water. There was no electricity. The cellars were packed with wounded, and civilians' amputation operations were performed without anesthetic, by the light of flickering candles, while dust shook from the ceiling with every explosion. On August 13th, a German tank trap, a Borgward demolition carrier, was abandoned near an insurgent barricade. The insurgents, thinking they had captured a tank, cheered. They drove it into the crowd. Suddenly, a massive explosion ripped through the street. It was a trap. Over 300 people were vaporized in an instant. Blood and body parts rained down from the rooftops for minutes. Yet, they held. They fought for every room, every staircase, every pile of rubble. But by the end of August, the Old Town was lost. The defenders had no ammunition left. They had to evacuate, but they couldn't go over ground. The German ring was too tight. They had to go under. This is perhaps the most harrowing chapter of the uprising. The evacuation of the Old Town through the sewers. The Kanawi, imagine a pipe, perhaps 3 feet high, filled with waist-deep, flowing human waste. Now imagine it in pitch blackness. Imagine it filled with thousands of people, soldiers, wounded on stretchers, civilians, trying to crawl miles to safety. The stench was overpowering. The toxic fumes made people faint and drown in the filth. The Germans knew they were down there. They opened manholes and threw down grenades. They poured in gasoline and set it on fire. They blocked sections with rubble to drown the refugees. Inside the sewers, it was a scene from Dante. People went mad from the claustrophobia. The wounded, dragged through the sewage, developed gangrene within hours. Guides tried to keep order, whispering directions in the dark, leading lines of terrified people holding onto each other's belts. Yet, miraculously, over 5,000 people managed to escape the old town through this subterranean nightmare, popping up in the city center like ghosts, covered in slime, their eyes wide with trauma. They were alive, but they had left a piece of their souls in the dark. September arrived. The weather turned cold. The uprising had lasted a month longer than planned. The city was starving. People were eating dogs, cats, and boiling the leather from shoes to make soup. The water supply was cut. People drank from puddles or risked sniper fire to reach the river. The Germans, methodical and ruthless, were reducing the resistance pockets one by one. After the old town fell, they turned on the riverside districts, Pawiśle, then Molotov. The insurgents were running out of everything. Ammunition was so scarce that orders were given to fire only when a hit was guaranteed. The homemade Błyskawice submachine guns were jamming. The captured German weapons were empty. Still, the Soviet army sat across the river, watching. In mid-September, in a cynical move, Stalin finally allowed a small force of Polish soldiers fighting under Soviet command, the Berlin Army, to attempt a landing across the river. But he provided them with no air support and no artillery cover. It was a slaughter. The Polish soldiers, desperate to help their countrymen, crossed the river in flimsy boats into a wall of German fire. Over 2,000 of them were killed or wounded in days. The beachhead collapsed. The message was clear. Stalin would let Warsaw bleed to death. By October 1st, the situation was untenable. The civilian population was dying of starvation and disease. The soldiers had no bullets. The hospitals were scenes of medieval horror. General Komorowski, the commander of the AK, faced the hardest decision of his life. To continue fighting meant the total extermination of the civilian population. On October 2, 1944, after 63 days of combat, the Warsaw Uprising capitulated. The terms of surrender were signed. The Germans, grudgingly respecting the ferocity of the Polish defense, agreed to treat the AK soldiers as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention, rather than executing them as bandits. A poignant silence fell over the ruined city. The guns stopped. Slowly, the survivors emerged from the cellars. They were skeletons covered in rags. They walked out of their city, past the German lines, into captivity or displacement. The soldiers of the home army marched out in formation. They were dirty, bandaged, and defeated, but they marched with their heads held high. They had fought the Wehrmacht for 2 months with pistols and bottles. They had not been defeated by a lack of courage, but by a lack of bullets and a surplus of betrayal. The fighting was over. But the tragedy was not. Hitler was not satisfied with victory. He wanted erasure. He ordered the Vernichtungskommando, the annihilation detachments, to finish the job. The civilian population was expelled. The city was empty. Then, with cold German efficiency, the demolition teams moved in. They didn't just bomb buildings, they drilled holes in the walls of palaces, libraries, museums, and churches, and inserted dynamite. They burned the libraries, destroying centuries of Polish literature and history. They blew up the royal castle. They dynamited the statues. They went street by street, leveling what little remained standing. By January 1945, when the Soviets finally bothered to liberate the city, Warsaw was a moonscape. 85% of the city was destroyed. It was a sea of rubble, silent and dead. During the uprising, 16,000 Polish fighters were killed, but the civilian cost was staggering, between 150,000 and 200,000 civilians died. Most were murdered in mass executions. The Warsaw Uprising was a military defeat. It failed to liberate the city. It failed to prevent Soviet domination. For decades, the communist government installed by Stalin tried to suppress the memory of the uprising, painting the leaders as reckless reactionaries. But they could not kill the memory. The uprising became the founding myth of modern, free Poland. It proved that the Polish spirit could not be crushed, not by Nazi terror, not by Soviet betrayal. Today, if you walk the streets of Warsaw, you will see a city rebuilt. The old town, reconstructed brick by brick from old paintings and photographs, stands as a miracle of restoration. But if you look closely, you will see the scars. You will see the bullet holes left in the stone walls, preserved as memorials. You will see the symbol of the kotwica, the anchor, the sign of the fighting Poland, spray-painted on walls. And every year, on August 1st, at exactly 5 p.m. W hour, the entire city of Warsaw stops. The trams stop. The cars stop. Pedestrians freeze. Sirens wail across the city. For 1 minute, the capital stands in silence. They stand for the students who threw bottles at tanks. They stand for the nurses who died protecting their patients. They stand for the 200,000 ghosts who watch over the city. The Warsaw Uprising was a tragedy. It was hell on earth, but it was also the ultimate testament to the human desire for freedom. A city died so that a nation might live.